Hi, Philosophy 71, and this discussion is about Simone de Beauvoir. Um, we finished with Mary Wollstonecraft last time, and there's about 150 years in between Wollstonecraft and de Beauvoir. So feminism was not dormant. There were some important movements. Primarily was the suffragette movement, beginning in the late 1800s, finally gaining the vote for women in 1920, and they not only were fighting for women's rights, but they were tied into the temperance movement. And initially, you might look at that and go, "Well, why were they fighting for both things? What was the point?" Well, what they realized was that alcohol abuse and even just alcohol use was a prime cause of domestic violence, and the victim of domestic violence was usually the female. So, as they were fighting for women's rights, they were also trying to protect women. They saw that alcohol was doing damage to not only women, but families, children, all sorts of things, non-productivity and work and so on. So they sought to end drinking and prohibit drinking and get some rights, at least the right to vote for women. They were successful in both to a point. Prohibition was enacted, but it didn't last long. Now, it didn't last long because people wanted to drink. It's just that simple. People put up a resistance to it, and we hear about things about the illegal taverns, about the bathtub gin, about the speakeasies, and that organized crime got organized because they were running alcohol. And all of that is true. But what you don't hear much about is that during the years of Prohibition, the rates of domestic violence dropped significantly. All of the ill effects of alcohol had been overcome, essentially. So there was not a complete elimination of domestic violence, but there was a big drop. When prohibition was repealed and drinking became legal again, we also saw that there was a return to the same levels of domestic violence that we had prior to prohibition. So, in between Wollstonecraft and de Beauvoir, we've got, some good activities. I didn't ask you to read anything from that period of time, but I've got you here now from with Simone de Beauvoir. So, Simone de Beauvoir was a French activist and philosopher and radical thinker, born in 1908. She died in 1986. And she's one of the early users of the term feminist. And she's got some views that are, on the one hand, important in explaining what feminism should be doing, and on the other hand, kind of damns women for what they haven't done. Simone de Beauvoir was a philosopher who supported the idea of existentialism. She and a few other scholars or philosophers supported this idea. Existentialism is the idea that you create yourself. You are basically born a blank slate. There is, nothing to you, no essence, and you become who you are through your freely chosen choices. So if you're not happy with your life, choose to be different, choose to make it different. If you don't like who you are, you think you're cowardly, choose to be brave. And you have created this, cowardice in yourself, or this weakness in yourself. So it's all about what you do. Now I find that really interesting. It not only fits with what she's saying about feminism, but I find it interesting in how it kind of conflicts almost with her own personal life. So Simone de Beauvoir was in a long-term relationship with French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, and Sartre was also, in fact, one of the primary existentialists. So he did not want to be married. Simone de Beauvoir did. She wanted to be married. She wanted to have a fairly traditional family. She was not happy with the arrangement that they had. Jean-Paul Sartre did not want to be married. He, in fact, did not want to be monogamous. And so during the length of the relationship with Simone, he had other lovers. He had women who were in serious relationships with him as well. And this did not make Simone de Beauvoir happy. I don't think it made anyone happy, but perhaps Jean-Paul Sartre. So here she is advocating for, well, if you don't like it, change it. She doesn't like what he's doing. Can she change it? No, only he can. So the existentialist idea or the existentialist claim that you're in control of your world might be problematic. She could have taken steps perhaps to change it. She could have, tried to persuade him. Apparently she did, but he was relentless. So contradictions perhaps. But let's talk about her book, The Second Sex. She wrote it and published it in 1949. So she makes a couple of points. Before we get fully into it, let's discuss what ultimately is one of her points. The difference between sex and gender. So sex is your biology, right? You are female or male, right? You have an innie or an outie. And depending on your biology, you are either female or male. However, terms like feminine and masculine, woman and man, those are learned behaviors. They're gender roles. You are not born feminine or masculine. You were born, in the sense, neutral, and I think she's right about this. You have certain natural inclinations to things, but generally, in terms of, whether or not you uh, you know, you wear high heels or you wear, lumberjack boots, that's learned, right? Of course, some of it, a lot of it has to do with our labor, and she points that out as well. But we just need to understand that these gender roles that you have are learned behaviors. From the second you were born, people are shaping, or the outside world is shaping what your role is going to be like. And, obviously, and contrary to Beauvoir and Sartre, when you're an infant, you are not making choices about whether you're going to be a baby that cries a lot or not. You just react. Okay, so in her book, The Second Sex, she asks, what does it mean to be a woman? And why do we even ask that? So in the world, we look at men as the normal. They are the stand-in human for all humans. They are the normal, and they are, as she calls it, the one. Women are not. So the term woman is relative to man. So man is the one. He refers to all human beings generally, while a woman is specific. And if you think about it, right, we talk about womankind all of the time. Pardon me, we talk about mankind all of the time, and we think and understand we mean everyone. But yet, if we talk about womankind, it's exclusive. We say, "Oh, well, that's just women," right? And that's just because of habit, that we have used that term thusly. So man stands alone as the one. The woman stands apart as the other. In other words, man's the normal, man is the natural, man is the one that leads the world, whereas woman is the one that is not as natural. She is separate, she is the other. She's an outsider, she's non-autonomous. She is not the ultimate absolute human. Masculine is, or male is the absolute human type. She is inferior. She is ambiguous. And by ambiguous, one of the things that de Beauvoir is talking about is this view of women as it's the whore Madonna contrast, right? Women are seen as either Madonnas, like, they're pure, they're innocent, they're saintly, some people look at their mothers that way. And then there's the complete opposite of that, the whore, the one who is, fuckable, the one who is there to please males or, society. So in that view, you've got quite a contrast. And one of the things that we see that's interesting is that um, women who are in relationships will have children, and after the first child, they are viewed differently than before. So before they have a child, before they're pregnant, they are seen as, maybe the sexually desirable, vixen, playful, whatever. And then she becomes a mother, and it's the Madonna complex. Oh no, she's mine, right? And we have actually documented, it's a fairly common experience in heterosexual couples that men have problems wanting to have sex with their wives after she gives birth, because they now view her as a mom rather than a sexual partner. Anyway, we have these ambiguous descriptions, where woman is, de Beauvoir says she is essentially evil, right? Because it's the whore aspect, but she's necessary to the good. She's necessary for reproduction, and she is inessential except as in service to a man or men. So she doesn't have an identity of who she is, a woman. What is a woman? And that's the question. What is a woman? And what does it mean to be a woman in a world where men are the first sex? You're the second sex if you're a woman. And she's saying, we wouldn't even ask that question about men. We would never say, what is a man? So, what is a woman? She goes on to not really answer it, but to explain that we are not born women or men. This goes back to the sex versus gender. We become a woman, right? We take on that gender role. So our learned behavior becomes our identity, right? I am a woman because that is the identity that I am comfortable with and have taken on as my gender role. So it's fitting with the existentialist view that it is chosen, right? And she may be right about that. So we look at history, though, and we look at the development of masculine and feminine. And one of the things that we can point to would be labor roles. And we can look back to primitive humans and the labor roles and say, this is the beginning of the dominance by men. So let's look at this, right? So there's a theory that goes around that say, well, women are giving life and they become, superior. And that's inaccurate. What is more accurate is to say it's not the givers of life, but the ones who risk their own life to provide for the family or the village that are the ones who become the superior group. So we can think of it like this. A female, once she hit the age of puberty, was either pregnant, tending to a child, perhaps hers or younger siblings, or menstruating, and it was like a continual thing. So she wasn't able to go on long hunts. She had a child with her, and that would be, I mean, they're on long hunts. They're searching for prey, and a crying baby might scare them off. Also, if she was pregnant, it would be difficult to do some of the traveling. The scent from her menses when she was menstruating could also alert prey or animals that humans were around. So women didn't go on hunting exhibitions. Exhibitions? Yeah. Okay. Women didn't go on hunts. They stayed at home. They took care of the family, and anthropologists will tell us that um, for the most part, the food provided for the family came through the efforts of women who gathered food and then would snare small animals and rodents, whatever, and that served as the protein source. So over time, as the men would go out to the hunting parties, and they would return having risked their lives and perhaps injured but they returned with meat, large animals that they had killed at the risk of their lives. And in doing so, there was a feast. So the daily feeding that was done by women was just expected and overlooked. The feast that was in honor of the hunters when they returned elevated the men and their labor. Look what they did. They went out, they risked life, they brought back a big dead animal for us to eat, and that became an element of causing them to think of themselves as superior and people thinking of them as superior. We are the hunters. We provide and we are celebrated. We see the development of warrior culture, of course, also against other people. And it's these efforts, these people who are taking risks, that are causing them to be elevated. Okay, so now we've got the split between men and women based on their jobs. And at this point, I want to just point out a little story I remember being told when I was in anthropology, or in a class in anthropology. And what had happened, and this was, maybe 30 years ago, is that a group of humanitarians went to some tribal villages that were suffering from famine in Africa. And they brought cows, and they gave every man in the village a cow. And then they left, and they came back a few months later, several months later, and the cows were all dead. And they were like, "What happened? Where are the cows?" And the men said, "But they died." And the people were like, "Why did they die?" And they were like, "Because they starved to death and they got no water." And the humanitarian group was just appalled, and they were like, "Why didn't you feed them and give them water?" And the men said, "Well, that's women's work," so they wouldn't do it. So the humanitarian group went to the women and said, "Why didn't you give these cows food and water?" And the women said, "Because the cows belong to the men. You gave them to the men." So using their Western understanding of society, the humanitarians gave the cows to the men, but it was the women who were supposed to take care of them. But since the women did not receive the cows, the men did. Okay? The women didn't take care of them, and all of the cows were killed. And you're getting a nice picture right now of my my dog's butt. So I hope you're enjoying all of that entertainment going on there. Anyway, back to Simone de Beauvoir. She says, "Look, if this is the problem, that there's this big division between men and women, and and a lot of it began with labor and so forth, why don't women band together to end their inferior status? I mean, after all, there are more women than men by a slight margin." So she says, "Other oppressed groups have banded together. Why haven't women?" And she says, "Oh, there's a big problem right here. There's no history, no religion of their own. There's no real past view of their own. There's no solidarity." And that's a big part. That is a huge thing. There's no solidarity. There's no solidarity of the work they do or of their interests. There's no community. And women, the group of women, are always divided by race and class. So for example, you might have a group of middle class white people here who are white women who are trying to bring about change for women. And then you have a group of upper class women who are trying to bring about change for women. And they don't come together. And you know, there might be trying to serve the same ideal, but they don't come together in a group because they're separated by class. At the same time, you might have the middle class white group of women and a middle class group of black women, and they don't come together because they're separated by ethnicity. So women are always divided by these different sections, or they always have been, and they live among men and they are attached to men, whether it's, you know, fathers or, you know, husbands, sons, whomever it might be. So they identify with this group that is not exclusively female. In other words, they don't come together in solidarity as a cohesive group to march together to bring about change. They identify with their male partners and their, you know, the males in their family, and they identify with the males in their group more firmly than they do with the women who are women, but maybe in a different group, whether it's racially or class and economically. So she's saying that we need to recognize that and we need to come together as a group. Now, she published in 1949, and of course since then we've seen a lot of change, pardon me, a lot of development of groups trying to form. But even in the early days, you know, in the 60s and 70s, when we had the formation of groups like the National Organization for Women, we saw that that group was primarily made up and certainly organized and run by upper class, wealthier white women. And they were not only exclusionary in terms of class and race, but even in terms of sexuality. For example, they said, look, we don't want any lesbians in the group because that will identify the rest of us as lesbians. And when we're trying to get improvement for women, then the general population or the dominant groups will look and say, oh, well, there's just a bunch of angry lesbians. And so, you know, lots of splits within these groups. We had the attempts to pass the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, and it has still not passed. And we saw conflicts on between women on passing that, and some women were like, oh, this makes sense. It's simply stating women should be paid for the same work, right? Equal pay for equal work. And then we had women on the other side, people like Phyllis Schlafly, who were like, well, no, that's not right because women belong in the home and men are the bread earners and so on, and some assorted bullshit like that. So women had not come together during de Beauvoir's time. Still working on it. Okay, but she says the changes that have happened in her time and prior to her time um, were not taken by women. Women didn't really achieve it. They have, in fact, she says, women have taken nothing. They only gained what men were willing to give them. So women got the right to vote because men were willing to allow them to have that vote. Some because they were motivated by um, the idea that women might have a brain and be able to vote. Some motivated because they thought, well, you know, women are going to be a real pain in the neck if we don't do this, so what's it going to hurt? Whatever it might be, de Beauvoir is blaming women for not achieving equality. And this also fits in with her existentialist belief that if you're not in a, you know, if your people aren't equal, it's your own fault. You need to go out and make that change happen. So people are working on it, but she's thinking that we're not working hard enough. I think that's it for de Beauvoir, and we will now move into the 60s and 70s for next time. Okay, bye.